Let's take a look at your market news now. Asian markets mostly rose on Tuesday as dealers await the latest development in the China-US trade talks, while investors look ahead to a key European Union summit that will decide Britain's immediate future in the bloc. Now, while the broad trend remains upward, sentiment was given a knock by news that US President Donald Trump had trained his sights on the European Union by threatening tariffs of billions of dollars worth of goods. Earnings season also kicked off in earnest this week with expectations low, but observers hoping for some positive forward guidance. A subdued array of greens in Asian markets, with the Nikkei edging up 0.2% to 21,802 points, while the Hang Seng was also 0.1% to the good, hitting 30,118 points, and the Shanghai Composite was the only decliner, falling 0.2% to 3,239 points. The S&P 500 and the Nasdaq edged into positive territory on Monday, with gains held in check by falling industrial stocks as investors braced for what Wall Street expects to be the first quarter of contracting earnings since 2016. The Dow Jones Industrial Average was the only counter to lose steam as it headed into negative territory, slipping 0.33% to 26,333. The S&P 500 inched higher to 2,894, and the Nasdaq Composite added 0.2% to end at 7,952. Let's go to the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. Arabile Gumede is standing by with more on the markets. Arabile, good afternoon. Over to you.
Yeah, good afternoon, Nzinga. Well, that market picture, as you noted there, had initially started off quite negative, actually, across the board, including the United States late last night, but managed to get into some sense of positivity by close of trade. Even this morning, we saw the JSE as well start a little bit in the red, but then has completely filtered through and made sure that it stays within some sense of positivity, even if it is only around 0.1% or so. So some positivity is indeed filtering through into the market, even on the global front. That's certainly come through. Some interesting news as well on the mining front, which we will unpack. Anglo Platinum saying that in the carbon tax issue may perhaps cost them up to 200 million rand in about 2 or 3 years' time. And also Rio Tinto looking for a 5.6 billion rand mine that they've opened in KZN, KwaZulu-Natal. Is certainly will be interesting on that front. Will certainly provide a whole host of jobs as well there. So let's unpack that market picture very quickly, and we'll get into it in just a moment. Well, that market picture, as you can tell, they're a little bit green across most of the board. And then there are a few dashes of red, of course, the likes of the DAX out in Germany, edging slightly lower. But let's chat to Chris Gilmore, now an independent analyst, as we unpack this market picture. Chris, thank you so much for the time. So I just want to start off, I suppose, immediately with that Anglo Platinum story. How much would that hurt? It's a deal that they say that the new carbon tax could cost them $21 million, or around 200 to 300 million rand. Up until, well, from 2021. And the chief executive there, of course, Chris Griffith, complaining that this could certainly hurt the company a whole lot more. How much impact do you think this will have on their abilities as a company?
Huge impact. You see, there's a very complicated set of dynamics here, if you think about it. On the one hand, you can understand why the government has imposed this, because they need to get as much money into the fiscus as possible. Same as with the sugar tax, for example. But if you look at how it impacts on a company like Impala Platts, they use an awful lot of energy to refine their ore that comes from under the ground. And that comes from electricity, which in turn comes from dirty coal, you know. So that's where the carbon tax element of it comes into it. So here you have this rather interesting situation where the government via Eskom is actually causing the carbon in the first place, but it's taxing the user. So I can understand the frustration of Chris Griffiths, you know, at Impala Platts. But to answer your question, that's a huge amount of money. Ultimately, it's going to mean, if at all possible, a probable reduction in headcount to try and offset the cost of the carbon tax with the cost of fewer
This
people.
is already a company that has gone through a huge restructuring.
Yeah.
They've tried to streamline their business as much as possible. The group itself, Anglo American, has tried to, offload assets that aren't necessary for the company. And yet here they sit with another issue on top of another one. At some point, it's not going to look worthwhile to be in this country.
Oh, and if you look at Anglo American, the top company, if you look at where their assets are these days, predominantly outside of South Africa. Look at BHP Billiton, what they did with South 32 a few years ago. You know, ring fencing their South African operations. So you're quite right. For a variety of reasons, be they energy, be they carbon tax, be they political considerations, although South Africa is still the biggest treasure trove of metals and minerals of any country in the world, accessing them is very difficult because they're getting progressively deeper and deeper. So the cost of extracting it is not that easy. And there are more enticing opportunities elsewhere in the world. Maybe not with platinum, funnily enough, because there are precious few places in the world where you can actually mine platinum in its ready state. I mean, Zimbabwe to an extent, Russia as a byproduct of the nickel process. But there are precious few places that you can do it. So look, they will be here for the long term. But it means that it's going to be an awful lot more difficult to actually do business here. And with a platinum price that hasn't really done an awful lot in the past few years, it makes the equation that much more difficult.
Yeah, and how difficult then does it become for Rio Tinto, finding a way to sort of shape its operations around a new mine that they're seeking out in KZN? And also, how many mines are there actually in a province like KZN?
Not an awful lot. Do you know, I'm trying to think what the mine was. I mean, up in Mpumalanga, they had that big hole. I'm trying to remember what the stuff that they pulled out there. They did it with Foscor as a sideline. So RTZ has been around in South Africa for quite a while. But I'd have to look into that in a much more depth to find out exactly what we're talking about in KZN.
Yeah.
But I mean, given as I say, the amount of metals and minerals in South Africa generally, now, there's an awful lot more. The problem is, and the question remains, is it economically viable to do so? Well, RTZ obviously thinks that it is.
Yeah. And at 5.6 billion, they're clearly seeing a lot to come out of it, clearly then for the future. What does this say perhaps to the government? Does this entice them to perhaps look at things again and say, indeed, we clearly do still have those minerals? And I mean, I'm sure they know this, but that we have to create that environment and continue to let investors believe that there really is a safer investing environment in South Africa.
No, absolutely. And I think with the appointment of Gwede Mantashe as the mining minister in recent months, I think there has been a greater interplay between the mining companies and government. And I think Gwede, he's a reasonable guy. No, sure, there are certain agendas in place there. But I think, you hit him with the background to all of this, and you show him precisely what it's going to cost. He's a bloke who actually will come to the party.
Yeah, that'll be of benefit, hopefully, and we'll continue to check in on that and see how it flows. Brexit going nowhere slowly.
Well, maybe it's going to pick up a bit of speed this week.
That's what we said a few months ago.
Yeah, no, I take your point. No, you're quite right. But I think we are reaching a point of inflection. April the 12th, Friday, 11 o'clock in the evening. If nothing else happens, then Britain crashes out. And I use the term crashes out advisedly because it will be a crash out. Yeah. Because then on Saturday morning, the shutters come up, literally. You'll have to have a hard border between Northern Ireland and the south. You're going to have all sorts of tariffs imposed. The trade with the EU will still happen, but it'll be a much more expensive exercise, far more friction involved. There'll be shortages of basic foods and medicines and all this type of thing. It'll be pretty chaotic for quite a few weeks. I don't think that's going to happen. But Theresa May's options have been severely limited because of what happened last night with the passing of what's called the Oliver Letwin Yvette Cooper bill, which went through the House of Lords and back to the Commons and now has got royal assent, which basically means that Parliament has said there cannot be a no-deal Brexit. So May, the Prime Minister, was using that as her kind of last bargaining tool, running down the clock, saying, it's my deal or no deal. Well, now with no deal off the table, it's her deal, or the option now is probably a revocation of Article 50, no Brexit.
Sure.
That will go down like a ton of bricks with her far right-wing colleagues in the Conservative Party. So she's trying desperately to hammer out a deal with the Labour Party, but she's giving no ground whatsoever in terms of her red lines, as they're called.
Sure.
So I don't think much is going to come out of that. I think it now rests with the EU 27. If they say, guys, we've had enough, we're sick, fed up of you, we need you to actually come to the party. I won't use the vulgar expression or get off the pot.
Yeah.
And so I think that's why I say I think we are reaching a point of inflection. By late Friday night, I think we'll know what's actually going to happen.
Inflection point indeed. Chris, really appreciate that. Thank you so much for the time. Chris Gilmore, independent analyst there. That Brexit saga will continue to watch out for. 14 Rand and 2 cents for the Rand as well against the US dollar. Quite interesting. Will it break that 14 Rand mark? We'll continue to check in on that. But for me, that's where the buck stops, and it's back to Nzinga right after this.